In the heart of a quiet suburban town, where every house looked the same, there stood one little home, filled with memories, love, and silence. This was Mary's home, a widow who had lost her husband years ago, yet still found comfort in the flowers he once planted. Every morning Mary watered those flowers, smiling faintly, as if speaking to the man she once loved. Across the street lived James, a hard-working man who often noticed her kindness and her loneliness. Though they rarely spoke, he always kept a watchful eye. But peace never lasts long. Karen, the head of the homeowners association, hated Mary. To her, Mary's house was too old, too different, too unwanted. With papers in her hand and venom in her words, Karen threatened Mary to leave. Mary trembled, yet stood her ground. Later that night, under the dim streetlights, Karen met with two masked men. Whispers filled the air, money exchanged hands, and a cruel plan was set in motion. Mary was not just a neighbor to Karen. She was an obstacle. It was just another quiet evening inside Mary's old house. The lights were dim, the air smelled of tea and old wooden furniture, and in the background, a radio softly played a love song from decades ago. Mary sat on her couch, sipping her tea, wrapped in a warm shawl. But suddenly, crash! The sharp sound of breaking glass pierced through the silence. Mary froze. Her teacup trembled in her hand, spilling hot drops onto the carpet. Her eyes darted toward the dark hallway, and before she could react, two shadowy figures crept into her living room. Their boots crunched on the broken glass, their faces hidden behind masks, their hands gripping metal pipes. Mary's heart pounded. She gasped softly, whispering, "Please, please no." But the men only exchanged a cold glance, stepping closer into the home she had built with her husband. The safe space where she once felt love was now invaded by fear. Across the street, James was just closing his garage after a long day. He was tired, his shirt stained with sweat, his hands rough from work. But out of the corner of his eye, something caught his attention. The faint glimmer of shattered glass reflecting under the streetlight from Mary's window. He paused, narrowing his eyes. Then he heard it. Mary's faint cry carried through the quiet night. His chest tightened. James dropped the tools from his hand and sprinted across the street. Every step he took, the fear grew stronger. What if he was too late? What if something had already happened? But he didn't stop. With only a crowbar in his hand and determination in his heart, James charged toward the door, ready to protect the woman who had always lived quietly, but never deserved such cruelty. The front door burst open. The intruders spun around, startled by the sudden noise. And there stood James, his breath heavy, his eyes blazing with anger. "Get away from her!" he roared. The two men laughed coldly, stepping toward him. One swung a metal pipe, but James blocked it with the crowbar, the clang of steel echoing through the small living room. Furniture toppled, glass shattered, and Mary screamed, covering her face with trembling hands. James fought like a man possessed. Every punch, every swing of the crowbar carried the weight of his rage. The intruders were bigger, younger, stronger, but James had something they didn't: the fire of justice. He wasn't fighting for himself. He was fighting for Mary. One of the men fell back against the table, blood dripping from his nose. The other tried to grab Mary, but James lunged, slamming him against the wall with a grunt of fury. "Not in this house," James growled through clenched teeth. The struggle raged on, furniture breaking, lamps crashing, and Mary watching in shock as her quiet neighbor became her unexpected protector. Just when it seemed the fight might never end, the distant wail of sirens grew louder. Red and blue lights flashed across the walls as the police stormed in, weapons drawn. "Hands in the air!" "Drop it now," officers shouted. The intruders, bloodied and defeated, stumbled back, raising their hands. They were shoved to the ground, handcuffed, and dragged out into the cold night. Mary collapsed onto the couch, tears streaming down her face, her body shaking uncontrollably. James knelt beside her, his chest heaving, his knuckles bleeding. "You're safe now, Mary. You're safe," he whispered softly, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. From outside, across the street, Karen stood in the shadows, her eyes narrowing with fury. Her carefully planned scheme had failed. And worse, James, the man she despised, had become the hero. Days later, the neighborhood gathered in the community hall for an HOA meeting. The air was tense. Karen stood at the podium, her voice sharp, dripping with venom. "This man," she shouted, pointing at James, "is a danger to this community." He broke into Mary's house, destroyed her furniture, and attacked innocent people. The room murmured with unease. Some neighbors nodded, unsure what to believe. But then Mary slowly rose to her feet. Her voice was shaky, but her words carried the weight of truth. "No," she said firmly. "James saved my life. Those men, they weren't innocent. They broke into my home. They wanted to hurt me. And Karen sent them." The hall went silent. Gasps filled the air. All eyes turned to Karen. Her face twitched, her lips curled in anger. But for the first time, doubt spread across the crowd. The truth couldn't be buried anymore. The case went to court. The courtroom was packed, tension running high. Mary sat beside James, holding his hand tightly as the judge reviewed the evidence. And then, the screen lit up with CCTV footage. Everyone watched as Karen, late at night, handed cash to the masked intruders. Her voice was clear, her intentions undeniable. The crowd gasped. Karen's face drained of color. She tried to protest, but her words meant nothing now. The judge's gavel slammed down. Guilty. The masked men were sentenced. Karen's reign of power in the neighborhood crumbled that very moment. She was no longer the feared leader. She was a criminal. Months passed. The neighborhood changed. The fear that once lingered had vanished, replaced by unity and respect. Mary's house, once under threat, now stood as a symbol of courage. Flowers bloomed brighter in her garden, as if celebrating her survival. And every evening, as the sun painted the sky with golden hues, Mary and James sat together on her porch, sometimes in silence, sometimes sharing stories. For Mary, those flowers reminded her of her late husband. But now, when she looked at them, she also saw hope. James never called himself a hero. He simply said he did what was right. But in Mary's eyes, and in the eyes of the neighborhood, he had become something greater. Because sometimes heroes don't wear uniforms or capes. Sometimes they live quietly across the street until the day destiny calls them to rise.